Good morning and happy Saturday to you. Today we're going to look at a passage in Mark chapter 6, just the first 6 verses, so not a lot, but it does bring to a close the larger section that we've been looking at of essentially responses to Jesus that actually kind of started in chapter 3, and we're going to look back at the beginning of that section in a minute here. And starting in 6 verse 1, it says, He went away, that is Jesus, went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. Now, his hometown is speaking of Nazareth. There's a question, as I've read the commentaries, some commentaries about this, is this the same event as Luke chapter 4? So in Luke chapter 4, Jesus comes to Nazareth. He stands up on the Sabbath in the synagogue, and he reads from Isaiah 61. He reads where it says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, the release of captives. And he stops, and the people marvel, at his gracious words, it says. But then there's also this, isn't this, as we're going to see here, isn't this Joseph's son? We know where it came from, because he said, these words are fulfilled among you. And so they begin to stumble over his humble origins, which is exactly what's going to happen here. And then he tells them a couple of stories of prophets who didn't do work in their own area, but who did work even among the Gentiles, kind of hinting at how the statement he's going to make in a second here, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. And I think especially because the stories were among the Gentiles, it says they were filled with wrath. They took him and wanted to throw him off the cliff, but he passed among them. The question is, in the Gospel of Luke, that's kind of towards the beginning. It's in Luke chapter 4. Here we're a bit further on, but as I noted before in the last teaching, the last video, the Gospels aren't always in chronological order. And so even though it seems to be later in Mark, it could be the case that Mark is recounting something that's earlier, because Mark's arranging things in a more thematic order, similar to Matthew, than Luke. Luke seems to be more chronological. That's my understanding of it. So we don't know exactly. Is he paying a second visit to Nazareth even after they tried to kill him here, and just showing his graciousness to continue to try and work among them? Or is this just another account of that of that event, which comes earlier in Luke? I don't know. But we're just going to try and pick out some of the big pieces here. And remember, the main point of this is, what is the response to Jesus? We've looked at different responses to Jesus. We've seen some wonderful responses of faith to Jesus in the last couple of sections. And now, unfortunately, we close out on an example of unbelief that causes the Lord to marvel. It says, on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? So they marvel. They say, okay, there's wisdom here. There's great wisdom. And we've heard he's doing marvelous works. So they even acknowledge the power of his teaching and the wonder. And it really kind of reminds me all the way back of Mark chapter 1, when he goes into the synagogue, and it says they were astonished at his teaching, and then also he cast out an unclean spirit, and it says they said, what is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. So similarly, they have some kind of acknowledgement of the power of his teaching and the power of his works, but they are offended because of his humble origins. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. One of the, I can't remember if it's the commentary or just the treasury of scriptural knowledge, which has cross references, pointed back to Isaiah 53, where it talks about he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. He was despised and rejected by men. There was no beauty that we should look at him, essentially. And so they don't accept him because he's lived a humble life among them. Which this is a strong argument against, really a defeater against the idea that Jesus was doing marvelous works among them, before he started his ministry. As there's some false gospels that have stories of him, like creating birds out of clay and then bringing them to life, or just other things like that. Or there's a story that he went to, Egypt as not like when he actually went to Egypt in Luke, in Matthew, in order to escape. Him and his family went to Egypt, but that he went to Egypt almost as like to study or as a guru or something. I'm not super familiar with the exact details, but you hear some of these stories of people trying to explain the years that we don't have much detail before he started to really work in the ministry that the Lord, his Father gave him, I should say. But this is a defeater. It says, is not this the carpenter? That's what he was doing. That's what he was doing. He was living with his family, and then he began to work as a builder, essentially, as somebody who worked in the trade, not just working with wood, but also likely working with stone, because that would have been what many things would have been built out of. We see that he's got also brothers, which we've got. He says James and Judas. Well, we've got books, the book of James, the book of Jude, written by them. He's got sisters, and so they took offense at his humble origins and the fact that he had no official teaching under a rabbi. And so it's like, okay, where did he get these things? He hasn't learned in that official sense, which there's a verse in the Gospel of John, I think it's John chapter 7, where he says, where did this man get these things without learning? And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. Now, this is where I wanted to go back and look at what his own parents, or his own family. Well, I guess his mom. In Mark, sorry, my mind's a little muddled this morning apparently. Mark chapter 3, verse 20 and 21. It says, then he went home, and the crowd gathered again, so that they could not even eat. And I think home in this case is talking about Capernaum, his home base of ministry, because it says, and when his family heard it, they went out to seize him. So it seems that he wasn't actually in his home, because otherwise his family wouldn't have had to go out. But it says, when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying he is out of his mind. They were saying, it doesn't just say they said, like one time, they were saying, he's not receiving respect even in his own hometown and among his household. And then there's a verse that's kind of makes you wonder, and that is verse 5. It says, and he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. He could do no mighty work. Does that mean that God can't work unless we allow him to work? Is his omnipotence dependent upon our faith? No, I don't believe that ultimately that's saying that, God cannot work without faith. I believe that that's speaking to God's plan in Jesus. That God's plan in Jesus is to bless people through faith. And this gets to, like James chapter 1, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives liberally to all, but let him ask in faith. It says to basically to receive, he must ask in faith. Hebrews chapter 1, or not Hebrews chapter 1, Hebrews chapter 11. Without faith, it's impossible to please God, because in order to come to him, we must believe he exists, and he is the rewarder of those who earnestly and diligently seek him. So God's plan is to bless people through the receiving of faith, of coming with a desire, with trust in him. Ultimately, the faith that leads to salvation, the faith that receives him as Lord, as Savior. And it says, by grace, we are saved through faith. We are justified. We're made right with God through faith. So it's a little bit of a puzzling verse, but I believe it's just speaking to God's plan in Jesus, of that normally these blessings are received through the hands of faith, and especially salvation is received through the hands of faith. So Jesus isn't going to be forcing healing on people who have no faith, have no receptivity to him. But he did heal a few sick people there. So he's gracious in the midst of it. And it says he marveled because of their unbelief. Now, this isn't in the Gospel of Mark, it's in the Gospel of Matthew, but there's one other place it says that he marveled because of their faith. And that was the faith of a centurion, a Roman centurion, a Gentile. But here he marvels because of their unbelief, their lack of faith. And then it says he went about among the villages teaching, which is kind of a summary statement that closes this section. So this section is all about what is our response to Jesus. Remember, I mentioned last time that the first half of Mark, through about Mark chapter 8, verse 20 or 30 something, it's about who is Jesus. And so before us is laid this question, who is Jesus and what are you going to do with him? One of the big questions we saw in the end of Mark chapter 4, the disciples said, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? And that's the question that's laid before us. And who is this? And what are we going to do with him? And that is a question that defines our eternity. Jesus has come, God incarnate, the beloved Son of God, in whom God is well pleased, God incarnate. And he's come to, as we saw with the man who was healed by the demons, he's come to set us free. He set that man free from demons, but he's ultimately come to set us free from sin. And the question is how will we respond to Jesus? Will we respond in faith? Faith that receives him, a faith that looks to him, a faith that honors him. And that's my hope, is that we will continue to look to him in faith. We will continue to pursue him by faith, to lay our needs before him. As the woman who we looked at last time, she said, I have this problem. If I just lay my hands on his garments, I'll be healed. Or the synagogue leader who came to him and fell before him and said, if you lay your hands on my daughter, she will be made well. This dependence, living in dependence and love of the Lord. So may the Lord give us grace to live in that way.